In 1946, as the British Empire was packing its bags to leave India, it made one last really desperate attempt to keep the subcontinent in one piece. It was this incredibly complicated plan, and it was designed to stop a division that almost everyone feared would be a complete catastrophe. But it failed, and that failure led directly to one of the most tragic events of the 20th century. So today, we're going to talk about that plan and how its collapse unleashed a human tragedy on a scale that's, well, it's almost impossible to imagine. To really get a sense of the scale of what we're talking about, let's just start with a number. 1.5 crore. That's 15 million people. A number so huge, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. That's how many people were torn from their homes in just a matter of months. Now, what's so critical to understand here is that this wasn't the result of a war or some kind of awful natural disaster. Nope, this was the direct outcome of a political failure. A complete breakdown in negotiations that would forever, and I mean forever, change the map of South Asia. To really get how this all happened, we have to rewind the clock a bit, back to 1946. The British were heading for the exit, right? But they were leaving behind a subcontinent that was an absolute powder keg, just ready to explode. It was deeply and dangerously divided. Okay, so let's get into the heart of it. You had two major political forces with visions for the future that were just completely opposite. On one side, you had the Indian National Congress. They'd been pushing for decades for a single, united, secular India for everybody. But on the other side, the All India Muslim League, they argued something called the two-nation theory. Basically, that Hindus and Muslims were two separate nations who just couldn't live together in one country. They were terrified of being dominated by the Hindu majority and were demanding their own separate, sovereign state, Pakistan. And if the situation wasn't tense enough, the 1945-46 elections basically poured gasoline on the fire. Just look at these results. The Muslim League won a staggering 75% of the vote in constituencies reserved for Muslims. This gave their leader, Jinnah, a massive mandate. It strengthened his claim that the League, and only the League, spoke for India's Muslims, making their demand for Pakistan seem absolutely non-negotiable. So into this incredibly charged atmosphere, Britain sends in a high-level team. Their mission? To try and broker a peace. And they came armed with one last, unbelievably intricate plan to try and bridge this divide that seemed, well, unbridgeable. And this plan was called the Cabinet Mission Plan. It was Britain's most elaborate, kind of its Hail Mary pass, to try and find some kind of constitutional magic trick that could satisfy both sides and, most importantly, transfer power to a single, united India. Now, the first thing the plan did, and this was a huge deal, was to flat out reject the idea of a completely separate Pakistan. The British argued it just wasn't practical. It would create massive new minority problems, lead to a geographically bizarre, moth-eaten state with two halves 1,000 miles apart, and it would totally wreck the economy. Plus, and this was a big one for them, it would deliver a deadly blow to the powerful unified Indian army. So, if not partition, then what? Well, here's the really clever part. They proposed this crazy three-tiered structure. At the very top, you'd have a super weak central government with power over only three things: defense, foreign affairs, and communications. That's it. Then below that, provinces would be forced into three groups, which would create powerful, autonomous blocks, some with a Hindu majority, others with a Muslim majority. And at the bottom, the individual provinces would hold all the rest of the power. The whole point was to give the Muslim League the substance of Pakistan, the autonomy they craved, without actually splitting the country in two. And for a brief, fleeting moment, it actually seemed like this fragile compromise might work. Both sides very cautiously said okay. But the whole thing, the entire structure, came crashing down because of how the two sides interpreted one critical and, as it turned out, fatally ambiguous point. It all happened on July 10, 1946. Jawaharlal Nehru, the newly elected president of the Congress Party, held a press conference, and he said something that would derail everything. He basically declared that, yeah, Congress was joining the new assembly to write the Constitution, but it would be completely unfettered, meaning it wasn't really bound by the fine print of the plan. Well, for the Muslim League, this was a five-alarm fire. A total betrayal. When they heard Nehru's words, they were convinced it was proof that Congress never intended to honor the spirit of the deal. They believed that as soon as they were in that assembly, Congress would use its massive majority to just tear apart those provincial groups. The very heart of the entire compromise. And this timeline just shows you how shockingly fast it all fell apart. I mean, look at that. In a little over 2 months, the plan went from being this hopeful proposal to a complete dead letter. On July 29th, feeling totally betrayed, the Muslim League officially pulled out. The last, best hope for united India, it was gone. And, this kind of political failure doesn't just stay in meeting rooms. It's spilled out onto the streets with absolutely devastating consequences. This was truly the point of no return. Now convinced that a peaceful, negotiated path was totally impossible, the Muslim League decided to show its strength in a different way. They called for a direct action day to demand Pakistan, not with words, but with, action. What was meant to be a day of protest, it descended into an unimaginable horror. In the city of Calcutta, communal violence just exploded on a scale nobody had ever seen before. It became known as the Great Calcutta Killings. At least 5,000 people were slaughtered in a few days of just brutal, vicious street fighting. This savagery completely shattered any last lingering illusions of Hindu-Muslim unity. That violence convinced leaders on all sides that the country was teetering on the brink of a full-blown civil war. Suddenly, partition wasn't a choice anymore. It was seen as a tragic but necessary evil. And that led to a new plan, a plan for division and an unspeakable human cost. In the absolute chaos that erupted after the partition was announced, it's estimated that more than 600,000 people were killed in communal violence. And that number again, nearly 1.5 crore people, 15 million, were forced to flee their ancestral homes, becoming refugees, desperately trying to cross a new, hastily drawn border to find safety. And amid the total breakdown of law and order, over 75,000 women were abducted and subjected to the most horrific forms of sexual violence imaginable. The damage was catastrophic on every single level. Nationally, the unity of the subcontinent was shattered, replaced by hostile borders and a security burden that continues to this day. Socially, generations of harmony were just erased, replaced by deep distrust and trauma. And economically, prosperous, integrated provinces like Punjab and Bengal were just torn in two, absolutely devastating their economies for decades to come. So you see, the failure of the cabinet mission plan and the trauma of partition didn't just create two new countries. It forged an enduring and often hostile rivalry. It left behind a future that was fractured and deeply scarred. And the socialist thinker, Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia, he absolutely hit the nail on the head later when he observed that the very problem partition was supposed to fix, that Hindu-Muslim divide, it wasn't resolved. In so many ways, it was just carved into stone, made permanent. And this leaves us with one final, really provocative thought. The decision to divide the subcontinent was seen at the time as a terrible necessity to stop a civil war. But when you look back at the more than 7 decades of conflict, tension, and human suffering that have followed, you have to ask yourself, what if the solution actually became a bigger, more permanent problem than the one it was supposed to solve?